Rock and roll was sold as freedom, rebellion, and truth. But behind the anthems that shaped generations, some legends were hiding acts so dark they were never meant to be remembered. These are not rumors, not myths. These are documented lives where fame protected behavior that should never have been protected. And before the countdown begins, ask yourself one question. How many of these songs would you still listen to if you knew the full story behind the person who made them? 25. Bill Wyman. For decades, Bill Wyman was known as the quiet backbone of the Rolling Stones, the reserved bassist standing behind louder personalities like Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. While the band cultivated an image of excess and rebellion, Wyman appeared restrained, almost invisible by comparison. That contrast helped preserve his reputation long after the Stones' wildest years. Behind that image was a relationship that remains one of the most disturbing chapters in classic rock history. Wyman began a relationship with Mandy Smith when she was only 13 years old, while he was a world-famous musician in his 40s. This was not a rumor whispered in tabloids. Wyman openly acknowledged the relationship in his own autobiography. Years later, when Smith turned 18, they married. The marriage lasted briefly, but the timeline remains undeniable. Despite the gravity of the situation, Wyman's career suffered little lasting damage. The Rolling Stones continued to tour, sell out stadiums, and cement their legacy. Public outrage faded quickly, overtaken by nostalgia and commercial success. The imbalance of power between an international star and a minor was largely overlooked at the time. Today, Wyman's musicianship is still celebrated, but his legacy carries an unresolved question. How did an admission so clear fail to produce lasting consequences, and what does that silence reveal about the era that protected him? 24. Tommy Lee. Tommy Lee became a symbol of excess in the 1980s. As the drummer for Motley Crue, he embodied the band's image: loud, chaotic, and proudly out of control. To fans, his life looked like an endless party, amplified by fame and tabloid attention. His marriage to actress Pamela Anderson only intensified that spectacle. Behind the glamorous headlines was a pattern of instability that eventually turned violent. In 1998, Lee was arrested after physically assaulting Anderson while she was holding their infant son. The incident was not dismissed as rumor or misunderstanding. Lee was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in jail. The case exposed a darker reality beneath rock star mythology. What had often been framed as reckless charm was, in reality, sustained aggression. While Lee served time, his career did not end. Tours resumed, interviews continued. The industry treated the event as a detour rather than a reckoning. For many, Tommy Lee remains an icon of rock spectacle. But his story raises an uncomfortable truth. When violence enters private spaces, fame often determines how quickly the world moves on. 23. Vince Neil. As the lead singer of Motley Crue, Vince Neil became the voice of one of the most commercially successful rock bands of the 1980s. His image, blonde hair, leather pants, and unapologetic excess fit perfectly into an era that rewarded indulgence. To fans, Neil represented freedom without consequences. That illusion shattered in 1984. After a night of heavy drinking, Neil drove his sports car through California streets with Nicholas "Razzle" Dingley, the drummer of Hanoi Rocks, in the passenger seat. Neil lost control of the vehicle and collided head-on with another car. The crash killed Razzle instantly and left 2 occupants of the other car with permanent, life-altering injuries. Neil survived. The legal outcome shocked many observers. Despite the severity of the incident, he received a sentence of 30 days in jail and served only a portion of that time. Financial settlements followed, but the punishment stood in stark contrast to the irreversible damage caused. Motley Crue continued to record, tour, and profit. Neil's career endured with minimal interruption, reinforcing the perception that celebrity could soften accountability. Decades later, the crash remains one of rock history's clearest examples of privilege altering justice, and a reminder that reckless behavior can carry consequences that fame cannot undo. 22. Gal. In the world of Norwegian black metal, Gal cultivated an image of cold menace and ritualistic intensity. As the frontman of Gorgoroth, his stage presence was deliberately unsettling, motionless, expressionless, and confrontational. Fans debated where performance ended and reality began. In 2004, that line disappeared entirely. Gal was convicted of extreme assault after holding a man captive for hours, subjecting him to severe physical violence and threatening him with further harm. The incident was not theatrical, it was criminal. Norwegian courts sentenced Gal to 14 months in prison. Unlike many artists whose controversies remain abstract, Gal's actions were documented and prosecuted. His conviction forced the black metal community to confront a difficult question. When an artist builds a persona around darkness, how much real-world harm is dismissed as art? After his release, Gal returned to music, continuing to perform and record. The genre absorbed the incident into its mythology, rather than rejecting it. His case illustrates how subcultures built on extremity can blur moral boundaries, sometimes allowing genuine cruelty to hide behind aesthetics. 21. Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy Osbourne built a career on shock. As the lead singer of Black Sabbath, he helped define heavy metal and earned the nickname Prince of Darkness. To fans, his outrageous behavior felt theatrical part of a carefully exaggerated rock persona that blurred satire and rebellion. Later, reality television reframed him as chaotic but harmless. Long before that reinvention, Osbourne committed acts that went far beyond provocation. In the early 1980s, during a record label meeting meant to symbolize peace, he bit the head off a live dove. Not long after, during a concert, he repeated the act on stage with what he believed was a rubber bat, only to discover it was real. The incident required immediate medical treatment and became one of rock history's most infamous moments. These acts were often excused as intoxicated mistakes or exaggerated stunts. Yet they involved real harm to living creatures, committed publicly, and celebrated as legend rather than questioned. Osbourne's career not only survived but expanded, transforming scandal into branding. His legacy raises an uncomfortable issue. When cruelty is framed as entertainment, where does responsibility disappear? Ozzy Osbourne remains beloved, but the line between persona and accountability was never clearly drawn. 20. David Crosby. David Crosby was associated with harmony, both musical and cultural. As a founding member of the Byrds and Crosby, Stills, and Nash, his voice became synonymous with the idealism of the 1960s. Songs about peace and unity cemented his image as a thoughtful, enlightened artist. Behind the scenes, Crosby was known for conflict and control. Bandmates repeatedly described him as volatile, egotistical, and destructive to group dynamics. His behavior contributed directly to internal collapses within multiple bands. Beyond professional turmoil, Crosby's personal life reflected long-term neglect and addiction, damaging relationships with partners, friends, and family. Crosby later acknowledged years of substance dependence that fueled erratic and harmful behavior. While recovery eventually followed, the damage done to those around him was lasting. Unlike many scandals that erupt suddenly, Crosby's pattern unfolded slowly, normalized by the culture surrounding him. He remained respected as a musical pioneer until his death. Yet his story exposes a recurring pattern in rock history, where artistic contribution overshadows sustained harm and accountability arrives only after consequences have already spread. 19. Sid Vicious. Sid Vicious became the face of punk rock chaos. As the bassist for the Sex Pistols, he was less known for musical skill and more for embodying the movement's nihilism, violent, unpredictable, and openly self-destructive. To fans, Sid represented rebellion taken to its extreme edge. That chaos followed him offstage. His relationship with Nancy Spungen was defined by addiction, volatility, and isolation. In October 1978, Spungen was found dead in a bathroom at New York's Chelsea Hotel with a single fatal stab wound. Sid Vicious was discovered nearby in a confused, intoxicated state. He offered conflicting accounts, at times admitting guilt, at other times claiming he had no memory of the night. The weapon used had been purchased by Sid days earlier. He was charged, released on bail, and never stood trial. Before the case could be resolved, Sid died from a drug overdose, ending both the investigation and any possibility of legal clarity. The truth of what happened that night remains unresolved. What is certain is that Sid's destructive lifestyle consumed everyone around him. Punk mythology often romanticizes his downfall, but the reality left one life ended and another without accountability. 18. Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry is widely regarded as one of the architects of rock and roll. His guitar style, songwriting, and stage presence shaped modern, popular music. Artists across generations cited him as a foundational influence, and his legacy was treated as untouchable. That reputation fractured in 1989. Authorities discovered that Berry had installed hidden cameras in the women's restroom of a restaurant he owned in Missouri. The recordings captured unsuspecting women and minors in private moments. The evidence was not speculative, tapes were recovered, and charges followed. Berry ultimately pleaded guilty and avoided prison through a plea deal. This incident was not isolated. Decades earlier, Berry had been convicted of transporting a minor across state lines for immoral purposes. These facts remained largely absent from mainstream narratives celebrating his achievements. Berry continued to perform and receive honors long after these revelations. His case illustrates how cultural importance can eclipse repeated violations, leaving audiences to confront a difficult reality. Musical innovation does not erase personal wrongdoing. 17. Good Game Allen. Good Game. Allen rejected every boundary associated with live performance. In the underground punk scene, he cultivated a reputation not as a musician, but as an embodiment of chaos. His shows were deliberately violent, unsanitary, and confrontational. Fans were not just spectators, they were targets. On stage, Allen routinely assaulted audience members, injured himself, and provoked riots. These acts were not metaphors or characters. They resulted in repeated arrests, venue shutdowns, and injuries. He was jailed dozens of times, and promoters often warned audiences of physical danger before his performances. Allen framed his behavior as artistic honesty, an attack on conformity and false morality. But the consequences were tangible. People were harmed, property was destroyed, public safety was routinely endangered. His performances crossed from provocation into real-world violence. In 1993, after a particularly chaotic show in New York City, Allen died from a drug overdose at a private party. Even in death, his body was treated as spectacle. Photographs were taken before attendees realized he was gone. Good Game Allen's legacy forces a question rarely asked in art. When does performance stop being expression and become abuse? 16. Ike Turner. Ike Turner was a pioneer of rock and soul music. Long before global fame, he helped shape the sound that would dominate American charts. Together with Tina Turner, he built one of the most electrifying live acts in music history. To audiences, their partnership appeared powerful and unstoppable. Behind closed doors, it was defined by fear. Tina Turner later detailed years of physical and psychological abuse inflicted by Ike throughout their marriage. Beatings were frequent. Control was absolute. She described being assaulted before performances, forced on stage to smile while injured. The abuse extended beyond violence. Ike controlled finances, career decisions, and personal freedom. The power imbalance was total. In a moment of desperation, Tina attempted to end her life. Her eventual escape with little money and no security became one of music's most famous acts of survival. Despite widespread acknowledgement of the abuse, Ike continued working in music for years. His talent complicated public judgment, allowing some to separate the art from the harm. His story remains one of the clearest examples of how brilliance can coexist with cruelty, and how long it can take for victims' voices to be believed. 15. Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis exploded onto the scene as one of rock and roll's earliest wild men. His aggressive piano style and unfiltered charisma made him a rival to Elvis Presley in the late 1950s. Songs like Great Balls of Fire turned him into a symbol of youthful rebellion and raw talent. That rise collapsed almost overnight. While touring in England, reporters discovered that Lewis had married Myra Gale Brown, his first cousin once removed, who was only 13 years old at the time. Lewis was 22. The revelation caused immediate public outrage. Concerts were cancelled, radio stations dropped his records, and promoters distanced themselves from his name. The scandal was not framed as rumor or misunderstanding. It was documented, acknowledged, and undeniable. Brown later described the intense pressure placed on her as a child thrust into the life of an international star, with no real ability to consent or escape. Lewis eventually returned to music years later, reclaiming commercial success and industry respect. Yet, the shadow of that marriage never disappeared. His case remains one of the earliest examples of how rock stardom tested moral boundaries, and how quickly public condemnation could fade once the music regained value. 14. Ted Nugent. Ted Nugent built his image on confrontation. Known for his aggressive guitar style and outspoken personality, he positioned himself as an unapologetic provocateur. Fans admired his refusal to conform and his willingness to offend. In the 1970s, Nugent became involved with a teenage girl who was under the legal age of adulthood. To bypass restrictions, Nugent legally obtained guardianship over her. This meant that her romantic partner also became her legal authority, a move that allowed him to control her movements and take her on tour. The arrangement was legal, but deeply disturbing. It exposed how power and wealth could be used to manipulate legal systems for personal benefit. Nugent later spoke openly about the situation without expressing regret, framing it as rebellion rather than exploitation. Beyond that episode, Nugent has admitted to deliberately sabotaging his military draft examination by extreme behavior to avoid service. His history is marked by choices that prioritize personal freedom over responsibility. Nugent's legacy highlights how legality does not equal morality, and how fame can normalize actions that would otherwise be condemned. 13. Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page is widely regarded as one of the greatest guitarists in rock history. As the creative force behind Led Zeppelin, he helped shape the sound and mythology of 1970s rock mystical imagery, experimental compositions, and unprecedented commercial success. To the public, Page represented artistic brilliance and control. Behind that image existed a story long discussed within industry circles, but rarely addressed publicly. In the early 1970s, Page became involved with Laurie Maddox, who was only 14 years old at the time. Page was in his late 20s, and at the height of global fame, according to Maddox's own accounts, she was removed from her home environment and kept hidden in hotel rooms while touring, effectively isolated and dependent. The relationship was treated as an open secret within rock culture. No legal action followed, and media scrutiny was minimal. The power imbalance between a minor and one of the most powerful musicians in the world was normalized by an industry that protected its most profitable figures. Led Zeppelin's legacy continued uninterrupted. Page's case remains one of the clearest examples of how reverence for talent can suppress accountability, allowing uncomfortable truths to remain buried beneath cultural worship. 12. Steven Tyler. Steven Tyler became the defining voice of American hard rock. As Aerosmith's frontman, He embodied excess, charisma, and longevity, leading one of the most enduring bands in music history. Public narratives often frame Tyler as a survivor, an artist who overcame addiction and chaos. A story detailed in the band's own autobiography complicates that image. In the 1970s, Tyler entered a relationship with Julia Holcomb, who was 16 years old. When her parents objected, Tyler persuaded them to transfer legal guardianship of their daughter to him. This arrangement allowed him to take her on tour and live with her without parental oversight. During the relationship, Holcomb became pregnant. She later stated that Tyler pressured her into terminating the pregnancy, an experience she described as traumatic and emotionally damaging. The relationship ended, but the consequences remained. Tyler's career never slowed. Aerosmith continued to sell records and fill arenas. His story demonstrates how fame can transform control into legality, and how power can operate quietly behind contracts and signatures. 11. John Phillips. John Phillips was celebrated as the architect behind the sound of the 1960s California Dream. As the primary songwriter and leader of the Mamas and the Papas, he helped define an era associated with optimism, freedom, and harmony. His music became inseparable from the cultural mythology of peace and love. Decades later, that image collapsed. In her memoir, actress and singer Mackenzie Phillips revealed that her father had subjected her to a prolonged sexual relationship that began when she was 19 and continued for years. According to her account, the abuse started on the night of her first wedding and evolved into a secret that consumed much of her early adulthood. The revelation shocked the public not only for its content, but for its contradiction. A man who wrote songs celebrating innocence and idealism was accused of betraying his most basic responsibility as a parent. John Phillips denied the claims before his death, but Mackenzie maintained her account consistently over time. The story permanently altered how his legacy is viewed. It stands as one of the most disturbing examples of private abuse, hidden behind cultural reverence, forcing audiences to confront how deeply illusion can protect harm. 10. Euronymous. Euronymous, born Øystein Arseth, was a central figure in the Norwegian black metal scene. As the guitarist and founder of Mayhem, he promoted an ideology built on extremity, nihilism, and the rejection of conventional morality. His influence extended beyond music, into lifestyle and belief. In 1991, Mayhem's vocalist, known as Dead, died by suicide in a house shared with the band. Euronymous discovered the body. Instead of contacting authorities immediately, he left to purchase a camera and returned to photograph the scene. He later collected fragments of Dead's skull and reportedly fashioned them into necklaces, distributing them within the scene. These actions were not artistic metaphor. They were real choices that demonstrated a profound lack of human empathy. Euronymous used the tragedy to reinforce his reputation and elevate the band's notoriety. 2 years later, Euronymous was killed by another musician connected to the same scene. His death ended one of the most infamous chapters in extreme music, leaving behind a legacy defined as much by exploitation of tragedy as by sound. 9. Varg Vikernes. Varg Vikernes emerged from the Norwegian black metal scene as a radical ideologue rather than just a musician. Under the name Burzum, he created music that was minimal, bleak, and deliberately confrontational. To some followers, he appeared as a philosophical extremist, rejecting modern society and organized religion. His beliefs quickly turned into real-world destruction. In the early 1990s, a series of historic wooden churches across Norway were deliberately burned to the ground. These were not abandoned structures, but irreplaceable cultural and religious landmarks, some centuries old. Vikernes was eventually identified as the primary individual responsible for several of these acts of arson. The violence escalated further in 1993. Vikernes traveled to Oslo and confronted Øystein Euronymous Arseth, his former friend and Mayhem bandmate. The encounter ended with Euronymous being stabbed multiple times and killed in his own apartment. Vikernes later claimed self-defense, but the court rejected that argument. He was convicted of murder and arson and sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum sentence under Norwegian law. Vikernes became an international symbol of how extremist identity, when reinforced by subculture and notoriety, can move from ideology to irreversible violence. 8. Ian Watkins. Ian Watkins was once the face of a successful modern rock band. As the lead singer of Lost Prophets, he gained global fame in the early 2000s, selling millions of albums and building a devoted fan base. His public image was energetic, approachable, and admired by young audiences. That image collapsed completely in 2013. Watkins was arrested and charged with a series of crimes involving the sexual abuse of children. The investigation revealed evidence so severe that details were largely withheld from public reporting. The crimes involved infants and deliberate coordination with others, documented through messages and recordings. The court described the case as among the most disturbing it had ever encountered. Watkins was sentenced to 35 years in prison. His bandmates stated they had no knowledge of his actions and immediately severed all ties, disbanding the group. Watkins' case stands apart in modern music history. It is not a story of excess or blurred morality, but of calculated exploitation hidden behind celebrity. His legacy is not complicated, it is permanently destroyed. 7. Gary Glitter. In the 1970s, Gary Glitter was one of Britain's most recognizable pop figures. His glam rock anthems became stadium staples, and his image platform boots, glitter-covered outfits, and chant-along choruses made him a fixture of popular culture. To the public, he represented harmless spectacle and nostalgia. Behind that image was a pattern of abuse that spanned decades. Beginning in the 1990s, authorities uncovered evidence that Glitter, whose real name is Paul Gadd, had been exploiting children for years. He used his fame and wealth to travel internationally, targeting minors in multiple countries. Investigations revealed repeated offenses, not isolated incidents. Glitter was convicted several times across different jurisdictions. He served prison sentences for possessing and creating illegal material involving children, and later for direct abuse of minors, some as young as 8 years old. Courts described his behavior as sustained, calculated, and predatory. Despite this, his music continued to be played publicly for years, often detached from the knowledge of who created it. Gary Glitter's case demonstrates how cultural familiarity can mask long-term harm and how entertainment can continue long after accountability finally arrives. 6. Phil Spector. Phil Spector was not a performer, but he shaped modern music as profoundly as many who were. As the architect of the Wall of Sound, he produced some of the most influential recordings of the 1960s, working with artists such as the Ronettes, Tina Turner, and the Beatles. He was widely regarded as a genius. That reputation concealed a long history of instability and intimidation. Spector was known for erratic behavior in studios, often threatening musicians with firearms. His obsession with control extended beyond music into his personal life, creating an atmosphere of fear around him. In 2003, actress Lana Clarkson was found dead from a gunshot wound in Spector's mansion. Spector claimed the shooting was accidental, but evidence contradicted his account. After 2 trials, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to prison. The man who produced songs about love and longing died incarcerated. Phil Spector's story illustrates one of the starkest contrasts in music history, where artistic brilliance coexisted with paranoia, violence, and ultimately, a life-ending crime. 5. R. Kelly. For years, R. Kelly was one of the most commercially successful figures in American music. His songs dominated radio, charts, and award shows, while his image blended emotional vulnerability with confident masculinity. To fans, He was a gifted songwriter whose music became inseparable from weddings, parties, and popular culture. Behind that success was a pattern of abuse that spanned decades. As early as the 1990s, allegations surfaced, accusing Kelly of exploiting underage girls. Lawsuits, settlements, and leaked recordings circulated for years, yet his career continued with minimal interruption. Industry support, legal maneuvering, and fan loyalty repeatedly insulated him from consequences. Everything changed in the late 2010s. Federal investigations revealed extensive evidence of sexual exploitation, coercion, and psychological control. Multiple victims testified that Kelly used fame, money, and intimidation to trap them in abusive environments. In court, prosecutors described his behavior as systematic and deliberate. Kelly was ultimately convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to decades in prison. His fall exposed not just one individual, but an industry that repeatedly ignored warning signs. His legacy now stands as a stark example of how long abuse can persist when profit outweighs protection. 4. Marilyn Manson. Marilyn Manson built his career on provocation. From the beginning, his music and imagery were designed to unsettle audiences, challenge religion, and provoke moral panic. Controversy was not a side effect, it was the brand. In the early 2020s, that persona collided with real-world allegations. Multiple women, including former partners, accused Manson of psychological, emotional, and physical abuse. They described patterns of manipulation, isolation, and intimidation that extended far beyond performance art. Several accounts were supported by contemporaneous messages and corroborating testimony. Legal cases and investigations followed. While some claims were settled or dismissed, the volume and consistency of accusations reshaped public perception. Record labels dropped him. Tours were cancelled. Longtime collaborators distanced themselves. Manson's case remains ongoing in public discourse, but its impact is clear. What was once defended as shock theatrics is now re-evaluated through the lens of power and consent. His story underscores how easily an extreme image can shield behavior until those shields finally collapse. 3. James Brown. James Brown was known as the godfather of soul. His influence on funk, rhythm and blues, and modern pop music is immeasurable. Brown's performances redefined live music, and his discipline on stage became legendary. To the public, he symbolized innovation, pride, and artistic authority. Away from the spotlight, his personal life revealed a long pattern of violence and control. Multiple partners accused Brown of severe physical abuse, including repeated assaults that resulted in hospitalizations. These accounts were not isolated. Police reports, arrests, and court records documented ongoing domestic violence across decades. Brown's behavior extended beyond private relationships. He was arrested numerous times for offenses ranging from drug possession to weapons violations. In 1988, he was convicted and sentenced to prison after leading police on a high-speed chase and threatening individuals with a firearm. Despite these events, Brown's career endured. Awards, tributes, and posthumous honors often minimized or omitted his history of abuse. His story highlights a recurring contradiction in music history: cultural impact, shielding personal conduct, allowing repeated harm to coexist with celebration. 2. Axl Rose. Axl Rose became the face of one of the most successful rock bands of all time. As the frontman of Guns N' Roses, his voice and volatile energy defined late 1980s hard rock. To fans, his unpredictability was part of the appeal. That volatility extended into real life. Former partners accused Rose of emotional and physical abuse, describing controlling behavior and violent outbursts. Lawsuits and restraining orders followed, painting a picture starkly different from the rebellious image marketed to audiences. Rose was also known for repeated on-stage meltdowns that resulted in riots, injuries, and property destruction. Concert cancellations and confrontations with fans became routine. While often framed as artistic temperament, these incidents caused real harm and financial loss to others. Yet, Guns N' Roses remained commercially powerful, and Rose retained control over the band's legacy. His case demonstrates how destructive behavior can be reframed as genius when attached to success, until the damage becomes impossible to ignore. 1. Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton has long been regarded as one of the greatest guitarists in rock history. From his work with Cream and Derek and the Dominoes to a decades-long solo career, Clapton earned a reputation built on technical mastery, emotional depth, and musical authenticity. To many listeners, he represented artistic integrity in its purest form. Behind that reverence was a personal history marked by harm, instability, and controversy. Clapton struggled for years with severe addiction to drugs and alcohol, a battle he later acknowledged caused deep damage to those closest to him. His behavior during this period included emotional neglect, destructive relationships, and repeated self-sabotage that affected partners, friends, and collaborators. Beyond his personal life, Clapton's public legacy became further complicated by his own words. In the 1970s, he made on-stage remarks expressing racist and extremist views, statements he later admitted and described as shameful. Decades later, during the global health crisis, his public positions and rhetoric again sparked backlash, distancing many longtime fans and collaborators. Clapton never faced legal consequences comparable to others on this list, yet his story occupies a different kind of darkness. It is the case of an artist whose brilliance coexisted with behavior that contradicted the values his music seemed to express. His legacy forces a final question. When admiration is built over decades, how much truth are audiences willing to confront to preserve the image they love? Music history often celebrates rebellion, excess, and defiance. But as these stories show, fame can also function as a shield, delaying justice, muting victims, and rewriting narratives. Talent created legacies. Power protected behavior. And accountability, when it finally arrived, came far too late. The question is no longer whether these figures shaped music. The question is how much harm society was willing to overlook because they did. Which name on this list shocked you the most? Comment below.